Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. On the program today, we will hear more about how the air quality in one small New Mexico community has some concern. We'll also learn more about how the Las Cruces Police Department worked to engage with families this summer. But first, we begin the program with Doña Ana County government announcing the installation of new public electric charging stations in the county. KRWG's Johnny Coker has more on how the new stations may be able to help add infrastructure for more sustainable transportation in the region.
County, state, and local representatives gathered at the Doña Ana County Government Center in Las Cruces to celebrate the installation of EV charging stations in Las Cruces, Hatch, and Anthony. In collaboration with El Paso Electric and the New Mexico Department of Transportation, the infrastructure upgrades are more economically beneficial than ever, thanks to federal initiatives like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, according to Assistant County Manager Jonathan Macias.
When we look at those operational costs of gas to electricity, that we have about a 1-to-4 ratio, and it just means that it would behooves us to at least look at our models and see where we can save that money. Now is a good time to be striking while we can get those government subsidies, because federal subsidies, I should say, because if we don't, then other communities will take advantage of them. So we might as well try to get our fair share for our community as well.
Macias said that the county's leadership has been advocating for expansion of the area's renewable energy footprint. And while the new EV chargers are a piece of that, he said that gas-powered vehicles aren't going anywhere.
There'll always be a place for that, especially in our own fleet, where we need heavy-duty vehicles and the technology is not there just yet for full electrification. But what it does mean is more option and choice, and quite frankly, a lower operational cost that we hope to pass back on in the form of reduced operation costs that we'll reprogram in our funding here at the county.
The charging stations are being energized by El Paso Electric, and Angie Rodriguez, Supervisor of Transportation Electrification at El Paso Electric, said the utility company will continue efforts to decarbonize their grid.
We got out of coal generation many years ago, and we're now focusing on development of more renewable resources. So when you charge an EV connected to our grid, you're going to be charging it with the lower carbon resources.
But as EV adoption becomes more commonplace, so does the need for a workforce that can implement the technology. NMSU's Dr. Olga Lavrova researches integration of renewables and new technology into the electric grid and said she's confident in the state's ability to integrate the new infrastructure.
As a technical person and as a researcher who has gone through all of the design procedures, I feel that there are no technical barriers. There are no technical barriers that we cannot overcome. The biggest challenge right now is just our social perception.
New Mexico's adoption of EVs is indeed on the rise. According to the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center, the state saw an increase of 2,900 electric vehicles between 2021 and 2022. Dr. Lavrova said that the university is preparing students for an industry that she said could eventually be as big as the oil and gas industry.
There are so many jobs that come along with electric vehicles, from highly skilled electrical engineering all the way to just regular jobs that are similar to what people are already doing. So EV station technician, EV vehicle troubleshooting, EV vehicle servicing. So it's replacing one type of vehicle with another, but the jobs are still staying the same. If not, there is a little bit of more jobs now because of the electric vehicle charging stations.
As Doña Ana County continues to build EV infrastructure, local stakeholders are optimistic that these investments will not only drive economic growth, but also pave the way for a more sustainable future in New Mexico. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker.
reporting from Capitol in Maine, recently shined light on air quality challenges in the small southeastern New Mexico town of Loving, located in the Permian Basin, a major oil and gas producing region. According to Capitol in Maine, air quality scientists found that air quality there exceeded the EPA threshold for ozone by 31 times. Joining us now to share more about his reporting on this issue is Jerry Redfern, investigative reporter covering the oil and gas industry in New Mexico for Capitol in Maine. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Jerry, can we start off by learning a little bit more about the town of Loving?
Sure. It's a small town. There's about 1,400 people who live there. And I kind of think of it as the entry point for getting into the Permian Basin. When I go down there to look around and to visit, it sits right there on the sort of western edge of the basin, and most of the traffic that goes in and out of the most productive areas of that region has to sort of come through Loving. It's this little town that's a very important sort of crossroads, and it's really completely surrounded by oil and gas production. There are tons of wells right in town, as well as surrounding it and such. So it's a small town, but with a very big and important place in New Mexico's oil production regions.
So last year, scientists began studying the air quality there. Can you tell us a little bit about this study and what they were looking at and what they found?
Right. So the group overall is called HEI Energy, and they have gone around to various towns in the United States and set up these monitoring programs to test the air quality essentially around oil and gas operations. An interesting thing about it is this HEI Energy Group is funded by the EPA and some very large oil and gas producers primarily. And they pay this money to see, what's the air quality like and what's happening in these oil and gas producing regions. They picked Loving because they found some local folks who are willing to help them do some volunteer work and get the message out. A large part of what they do is provide the information that they collect to local townspeople so that they know what's in their air and where it's coming from, essentially. And what they found in Loving were shockingly high levels of what are called volatile organic compounds. They're the really smelly stuff, say that you smell in gasoline or diesel fuel. That's what makes it stink, right? The benzene and the ethane and various other chemical compounds like that. And they found amazingly high levels of that, all of which also contribute to creating ozone, which is the other main thing that they were looking for. And all of this, to be clear, is coming from the oil and gas industry and the production that's happening right around and in Loving.
It has to be pretty unique to find a town this size having the air quality that may be comparable to a major city in the U.S. Is that correct?
Yeah. Pretty much every other place in the United States where the EPA is testing ozone levels has had levels drop in the last 30 years. And of all places, this particular part of the Permian Basin is one of, I think, 7 out of hundreds that is actually either not going down or increasing over the time frame that the EPA has been monitoring these things. So it really is an astonishing outlier.
So how are these findings perhaps impacting the Clean Air Act?
Well, it's pretty, the Clean Air Act was originally set up to help clean up, funny thing, was originally set up to help clean up big cities and the pollution that we all sort of have in our minds for, like, Los Angeles or Denver or New York City or Dallas, places like that. And what it's also come, I think, to find is that these sorts of pollution problems don't just happen in big cities. But when that Air Act began, roughly 50 years ago, that's what it was targeting. And it has actually brought down pollution levels in most of those large cities. As I was saying, there are only a handful of places in the United States anymore where these levels are not dropping and are actually rising. A couple of places like Loving. So in the story, I compare the pollution levels, the ozone level in Loving, to I picked it at random, Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, because it happens to be where Capitol Maine is based, and picked an air monitoring station essentially down the street from where the Capitol Maine offices are, without thinking about it too much, and realized, whoa, this is this is way different. So yeah, it's kind of astonishing.
Yeah, I'm sure our audience is pretty familiar with air quality challenges in downtown Los Angeles. I want to hear from you, though. Through your reporting over the years, you've certainly talked with some health officials. What do they say about what exposure to these compounds, how that may impact health in the region?
Yeah, the science on this is extremely clear. Ozone is bad for you in pretty much any amount. It's an extreme lung irritant, and the higher the levels of it, the more irritating it is. So people who have asthma, who have bronchitis, who suffer from allergies, any of those sorts of things, ozone's going to affect that. It's going to make it worse. And if you don't have breathing issues, it will make it more difficult to breathe just basically in the first place. The other thing is that a lot of the chemicals that the HEI Energy Group measured in Loving, those volatile organic compounds I was talking about earlier, a lot of those are just known to be cancer-causing agents with no safe level. You know, there's no amount that the EPA says it's okay to breathe in this amount of it. Something like ethane, it's just bad, and you don't want to be around it or be breathing that in your air. And yet it's there in distinctly measurable amounts. So yeah, these things are not good. It's very polluted air.
Your reporting also mentioned that there was a radiation plume that was perhaps found in the area as well. Can you share more about that?
Unfortunately, I can't say a whole lot more about it, not because I'm hiding it, but it seemed to be something that the group themselves were kind of surprised to find. They don't know what's causing it. They don't know where it's coming from. As I reported in the story, the EPA itself, you know, the parts of the EPA that track radioactive pollution and radiation and such, they do note that radiation contaminated equipment is part and parcel of the oil and gas industry. It comes up with particularly with the water, the produced water that we've heard about in other stories. That a lot of that produced water tends to be radioactive to varying amounts, and it builds up scale inside the pipes and stuff. You pull those pipes out of the ground and clean them out, you suddenly have a plume of radioactive dust. And I'm just bringing that up as an example. That's one way that this could be showing up. Another way that it could be showing up is through other things in the industry. The same company that did this work in Loving has worked in the Denver-Julesburg Basin north of Denver, where there's a lot of air pollution as well, and they found a radioactive plume there that was actually coming from a refinery. And Loving doesn't have a refinery nearby within a few miles, so it's not clear where it's coming from. I'm talking a lot. The main thing is they don't know where it's coming from, but there's no question that it's there.
So in your conversations with community members in the town, what were some of the things they were saying?
The main thing, you know, when I spoke with Josie Zuniga, she was saying particularly just that over the years that she's lived there, and she grew up there and still lives in the towns around there, in a town nearby, that the production just continues to increase and continues to encroach on the town. And that, for example, her grandmother's backyard has 6 natural gas lines running through the back of it, which are, you know, new since Josie herself was a kid. They hear booms regularly of the blasting that goes on around, you know, laying pipelines or oil production. There are the flare stacks that are all around Loving. I've seen that myself. It's astonishing. And those have been going up with incredible frequency in the last few years as the boom has continued down there. So I think the main thing that people have noticed is that production is booming, continues to boom, and it is now like literally on their doorsteps. Not joke, not just an expression. It's literally on their doorsteps in Loving.
So what has been the response from regulators in regards to the findings of this study?
So it kind of depends upon the regulator. Here, the New Mexico's Environment Department, when I wrote back and forth with the people there about this, they know about this. They have their own data that they pull from a monitoring station in Carlsbad, and that has shown them for years that they know it. they know that these levels are elevated. They've known this for years. The question then gets to what can they do about it? And they point back to the EPA. When I asked the EPA about this, EPA says, well, it's up to our discretion whether or not we bring an area, a county, or something like that, and declare it non-attaining. They have all sorts of funky words for these things. It's, they have the discretion to say whether or not they're going to do it. And they've said, in our discretion, we're not going to do it at this point because various new rules have come into play that should hopefully bring these pollution levels down.
Well, what new rules were they talking about? Are you just mentioning like the EPA's newly announced rules that were mentioned this year?
Both the state and the EPA have new rules. So the EPA's own methane rule came out back in May. They're still sort of polishing it around the edges. And that's essentially banning all venting and flaring from oil and gas operations. And down the line, there's another rule that should come into place that will start taxing, essentially, they call it a fee, but essentially taxing any losses in the natural gas production chain. We'll see if and when that actually comes to pass. The state's had its own rules in place for a couple of years now. There's the methane rule from the Oil Conservation Division and the ozone precursor rule from the Environment Department, both of which come at the problems of oil field leaks from different directions, hoping to have the same general effect to keep all of the gases and venting, et cetera, in the pipeline and going to market rather than being released into the air. But the thing is, since those rules have gone into play back starting in 2021, production has increased and the amounts of methane that operators are saying they're venting and flaring has not noticeably decreased. So the rules do not necessarily seem to be having the dramatic effect that they were intended, at least not to this point.
So when you talk to regulators and people who are concerned about this issue, what are some of the things they're saying? The state announced these new rules, the EPA has their new rules, but it seems like this issue is still persisting. So what sort of questions do people have right now for lawmakers and regulators?
I think the biggest question that the people I was speaking with have is, why is this still happening when the data is so exceptionally clear and it's available to all of the parties involved in that? The EPA knows this. The State Environment Department knows this. The Oil Conservation Division here in New Mexico knows about this as well. And the question that comes from folks who don't work for those groups is, why isn't more enforcement happening? Why isn't more coming down the pipe to sort of bring these emissions back into control? And it's a good question. It's just not, that's not happening yet.
Is this an issue of resources and funding that may be perhaps getting in the way of the monitoring that may be needed for this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you'll have a hard time finding a state agency that doesn't say that it needs more money, no matter how much they get. But to sort of put it into perspective, I'm trying to remember this off the top of my head. Production in the state of New Mexico since roughly 2010 has gone up tenfold. Essentially 10 times more oil is being pulled from the ground in New Mexico now than happened in 2010. And our state budget reflects this, with the billions of dollars that are coming into the state budget the last several years, these record budgets that we're having, courtesy of taxes on oil and gas production. At the same time, the budgets for the two main regulatory bodies in the state, the Oil Conservation Division and the Environment Department, have not kept pace with that at all. They're not following that particular trend. So you have a great deal more production happening. You have more companies. You have more wells being drilled. You have more complicated wells being drilled, and you don't have the number of people to sort of follow up and track all that down, because they don't have the money to hire those people to do that. I think that's not me making that up or making an environmentalist point. It's the numbers show it's just the one's just not tracking the other.
After your conversations with state regulators and perhaps state lawmakers, do you hear anything about this potentially being an issue that may be addressed in the legislative session in 2025?
That's what I have calls out right now, trying to find out. I think it's still a bit early for a lot of legislators coming out and saying what their big pushes are going to be. I think, too, a lot of the way that the politics works in the state, if somebody's coming up with strong legislation dealing with the oil and gas industry, it tends to show up later. It's been my experience, just because then it doesn't give oil and gas industry greater amounts of time and resources to come up with counters to it. That's me speaking a little bit as a reporter watching this for the last few years from outside. But I would imagine that, yes, there are going to be, once again, a couple of bills, I would should say think at the very least, that would be addressing these sorts of issues of emissions coming from oil and gas.
Your reporting mentioned the Colorado's Front Range communities that were dealing with a similar issue. You brought this up earlier in our conversation as well. Was there any differences in the way this issue was addressed in Colorado compared to how it's being addressed in New Mexico?
Well, yeah, the main issue was that the EPA declared it an ozone non-attainment zone and forced the state of Colorado to come up with rules and ways to dramatically reduce the amount of ozone being produced along the Front Range there. So Colorado in that Front Range, I guess, every state and every place is its own place and they're all different. But Colorado particularly had a problem with traffic and cars and people burning the fossil fuels, right? All of that traffic in the greater Denver metro area. If you've ever driven up there, I don't have to explain it beyond there. It's just a mess. And there's just millions of people driving millions of cars, millions of miles every year in that whole area, which leads to a lot of the smog and ozone pollution there. And EPA saw that years ago, declared it a non-attainment area. And since then, in Colorado has implemented steps to reduce ozone and other emissions, and it's worked.
There's certainly a population difference in those communities compared to this part of New Mexico that we're discussing. But in your reporting, you also write about the economic differences in that. Do you think that may be playing a role as well?
I don't really know. That's an interesting thing. It's hard to tease those particular arguments out. I think it's doubly interesting you brought up just the general population level, just to touch on that quickly. There are how many millions of people who live in I think 6-some million people live in the greater Denver metro area, and there are 100-some thousand people who live in Eddy County. The pollution that's happening, that's being measured in Loving and in Carlsbad, is not coming from the people who live, well, it's coming from the people who live there, but it's not because of the large population that happens to live in that area. It's not coming from people commuting. It's not coming from people driving their cars back and forth. It's coming from the production aspect of oil and gas. And whether or not, the enforcement happens or doesn't because it's a small, poor town in a small, poor state, that's a good question. I should probably ask that of somebody.
Well, speaking of questions, what are some of the questions that you still have left regarding this story and this issue in that area?
Well, it turns out that, there are other ways for the EPA to be nudged to call this a non-attainment area, to call that part of New Mexico a non-attainment area. And without giving too much away, I'm starting to ask those questions and get people to say why they haven't done more to get it to that point. And I'm still kind of waiting on some of those answers before I go beyond that. But I think an interesting thing about this too is how the Clean Air Act works when talking about ozone and non-attainment. It's not like EPA says, this is a non-attainment zone, state, get your act together, let's get going. and you're going to see a rather quick drop
Yeah.
in pollution from whatever's causing the pollution. This is a year's process before anything would be seen. There's like an 18-month opening salvo from the federal government to the state, and then a 6-month window for the state to respond, and the next month's, that goes back, and then it's an open questioning period. So, it would take a couple of years at the quickest for a non-attainment notice like this to actually begin to have some effect.
Okay, I see. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Jerry Redfern is an investigative reporter for Capital in Maine, covering the oil and gas industry. Jerry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for having me on.
Moving on, this past summer, the Las Cruces Police Department worked to engage the community with some family fun events. Producer Courtney Hill has more in this Community Connection.
Yeah, so this started with our community advocates who work with community outreach out of Las Cruces Police Department. They partnered up with Raising Cane's to offer lemonade lunches at the splash pad, and we offer a safe outing for family and kids to come out and have fun during the day. Oh, the turnout was amazing. So this is the third event. We have 3 more to go, which are advertised on our Facebook group and our Instagram. But I think word of mouth has been getting around and recognition has been getting around, and today we had a full splash pad. People came out to have their lunches, people came out to have fun, and we actually had a birthday party being celebrated out here today.
We are here with LCPD and we're partnering with them to supply fresh lemonade to all the kids in the city. They come to the launch pad and they get to play and have fun and get nice and cool for the summer. Response has been really, really great. We started in the beginning of July, so we started the first Friday and the last Friday of every month, and it seems like it's just getting larger and larger every month that goes by. We always have fun. It's always a good time.
I love bringing my grandson here during the summer. It is such an awesome place. They distract themselves, they get wet. It's just a nice way of getting them out of the house and interacting with other kids around the community.
Anything that the community may want to refer to or have a question, we have officers here. We also have Libby, our dog, visiting with the kiddos, and they were petting her. They are having a wonderful time.
Thank you for joining us this week for Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.